All right. Welcome, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Remark Institute. I'm Stefanos Geroulanos. I'm the director of the Institute, and it's a pleasure to see you back here, so many of you, for our event with François Hartog. Together with me today, as usual, are Sam Paul, Amy Nguyen, and Lauren Lee. I think Lauren is downstairs helping. And above all, François Hartog. And it's a pleasure and an honor to welcome you back to the Institute, and this time to actually give you the chance to present your thought properly. The last time was, shall we say, somewhat abbreviated. If you're my age or older, you probably first encountered François Hartog with his classic The Mirror of Herodotus, which came out in 1980. Amid an efflorescence of writing on the Greeks by figures from Nicole Leroux to Jean-Pierre Vernon. In The Mirror of Herodotus, Hartog famously picked up the question of the other and staged it across the Scythian narrative of Herodotus's histories. It was both a study of difference, and as he wrote, polarity, and also sort of a meta-study at the historiographical level, a field in which he has been an absolute leader, both in France and internationally. And if on the one hand, he has studied at length the 19th century's historiographical constructions and claims and hopes, from Fustel de Coulanges to Renan, to the establishment of the discipline itself. On the other, he has also been committed to questions of the frontier, the border, and rhythm of the other. So if I were even to list his books, we would take way too much time, and he wouldn't have enough time to talk. And so you can go on Wikipedia to save yourself on that front. But I do have a particular love for Hartog's Regimes of Historicity, a book that came out in 2001 and took over a decade to be translated into English, and one of the definitive studies of temporality and historicity for our time. In Regimes of Historicity, Hartog details the treatments of relations between past, present, and future as key systems, not only for thinking historically, but for thinking and for belonging together. He raises significant and enduring questions about the present time's commitment to itself, notably in the conclusion where he writes, quote, "The present can no longer be understood or only partially as an odd in-between period in historical time, during which," this is a quote within this quote, "during which one becomes aware of an interval in time which is altogether determined by things that are no longer and things that are not yet." And of the quote within the quote, "On the contrary, this presentist present seems to be determined by nothing other than itself." In his more recent Chronos, The West Confronts Time, Hartog continues along the side of questioning of temporality, presentism, and history by following the Greek terms chronos, crisis, and kairos, which he treats as key concepts for the ordering of time. And he shows how the New Testament's particular translation of the Greek term ones helped establish a specifically Western notion of time that has persisted. This temporality may have emerged in Christianity, but it continues into the ordering of the modern world, which makes this book, Chronos, a temporal study of secularization, so to speak, of a political philosophical theology. Now, Hartog is bringing out Partager l'humanité, Humains, humanismes, inhumain, with Gallimard next month, which is the book that he will present from and speak to us about today. I think we would translate it as to share humanity, but I wasn't sure how to make the infinitive, and I thought I would leave you the version of this. So yeah, all the more reason to leave the stage to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Stefanos. And of course, thank you for this invitation. And I thank the Remark Institute and the staff of the Remark Institute, and which made possible this meeting today. This presentation comes, as you said, from a forthcoming book, title of which is, as you said, Départager l'humanité, humains, humanismes, inhumains. Well, by départager, I mean to divide, to distribute, to allot. It's actually the very act of dividing that captured my attention and guided my questioning all the way along. Whether you read the opening verse of Genesis or the first lines of Hesiod's Theogony, these are all stories of dividing. For God, to create is to make divisions, to separate. For Hesiod, we go from the initial chaos and through a series of begats, which are as many divisions, to the fixings of those order, and finally to the delimitation of a human condition that is, to tell the truth, not very enviable. Here, today, I'll confine myself first to Greek anthropology alone, with the aim of following the logic of its development from its central question, mortality. Then we'll leap without transition from this constitution of anthropos in a universe which, though long since bygone, has nonetheless left its mark on the rest of European history. So we move to its contemporary dissolution. If, at the risk of being caricatural, I leave here aside all the intermediate stages, all the successive division between what is human, only imperfectly so, or not at all, I am in no way suggesting that there was a teleology at work, leading from this initial constitution of anthropos to its dissolution. So a few words about the constitution of anthropos. All men are mortal. Socrates is mortal. Therefore, Socrates is a man. A famous syllogism, if ever then there was one. In Greece, the recognition of this anthropological fact was thought out and institutionalized through a first great division. The inescapable death of human beings was answered by the immortality of other beings, as if recognizing one's own mortality could only be achieved by attributing immortality to other superior, distant, and not necessarily benevolent entities. The human condition is conceived from an initial paradox. Anthropos, man, in the sense of the human race, is opposed to theos, the divine being. In fact, mortality is not conceived from immortality, which would be primary. We go from the mortal to the immortal. Immortals are defined negatively, athanatoi. They are exempt and, as it were, deprived of death. The positivity of immortality can only be conceived in terms of its antonym, the brief and ever precarious life of mortals. Who or what are these radically other beings? Primitive powers emerging from the abyss, superior entities such as the stars, but also supernatural forces. Gradually, divinities emerge with their distinctive features, genealogies, attributes, and areas of competence. They came to form pantheons, which end up constituting veritable, ever more ramified organigrams of the divine. For Herodotus, it is understood that it was Homer and Hesiod who, I quote, established a theogony for the Greeks, attributed to the gods their qualify, divide among them honors and skills, drew their figures. If gods and goddesses last forever and reside in the lofty mansions of Olympus, They have not always been there. In short, they have a genealogy. 2 points are worth noting. Immortal, the Greek gods are not eternal, but sempiternal. They have a birth, and once born, they last forever. In those early days, however, the boundary between divine beings and mortals was not absolute, but Zeus, from the day he becomes father of gods of men, imposes his order. He intends to forbid these transgressions. With a God eternal and creator of all things, one has to think out a new anthropology. By detailing the establishment of the sovereignty of those from whom nothing escapes, Hesiod also explains the misfortunes of the human condition. This is the first important point, for by establishing the respective lots of gods and men, he puts into form a narrative, an early Greek anthropology. The epic narrative becomes a learned theogony that is also an anthropogony and a theodicy, insofar as Hesiod justifies world and social order from Zeus' point of view. Few words about the miseries of human condition. As for humans, 2 passages, one in the Theogony, the other in Labors and Days, define their condition. The first, which brings those face to face with Prometheus, also immortal, marks the separation of gods and men, dividing the orcs unequally with the gods on one side and mortals on the other, means that the initial commensality with the gods is over. For the gods, it's the fat cover bones. For human, it's the skin, flesh, and entrails. Clearly the good bit, while the gods seem cheated. Hence, the anger of Zeus, who was in fact plotting the ruin of the mortals. He retaliates by depriving them of fire. In reply, Prometheus, ever benevolent, managed to steal it and return it to mankind. Zeus is furious again, and, quote, instead of fire, he creates an evil destined for humans, Pandora, the woman, a deep and dead end trap. This confrontation, where cunning and violence mingle, first confirmed Zeus' order. Then, as the story progresses, the conditions of mortals becomes clearer. They must offer sacrifice to the gods. To do so, they must practice animal husbandry. No wild animals are sacrificed, as well as agriculture, to feed women's insatiable bellies. It goes without saying that fire is needed to cook flesh and prepare bread. The unequal dividing of the ox seems to favor humans at the expense of the gods, but in reality, the smoke of the sacrifice is enough for the gods, who feed on nectar and ambrosia, while mortals can only subsist on solid foods. Lastly, although Pandora gave birth to the race of women, she is nonetheless the necessary evil that through marriage ensures the succession of generations. Thanks to her, parents do not grow old in misery and escape a lonely death. This is how Zeus, meditating on the ruin of mortals, completed, starting with the unequal sharing of an ox. In Labors and Days, Hesiod again returned to the miseries of the human condition. A conflict with his brother leads Hesiod to recall how hard labor was imposed on mankind following the confrontation between Zeus and Prometheus. And even more than in the Theogony, Pandora is presented as the main cause of the misfortunes that have become the lot of mankind. A veritable fabrication of Hephaestus from earth and water, she is also endowed with all feminine trappings and graces, not too much, thus fashioned by all the gods according to their respective attributes. She receives her name of Pandora, Doron meaning the gift in Greek, because it's all the inhabitants of Olympus who, with this gift, make a present of misfortune to bread-eating men. From the outset, the woman's lot is that of a necessary evil, by means of which the gods deceive mankind, taking a revenge for Prometheus' deception. For Hesiod, what's important to reiterate is that there is no escape from the designs of Zeus. That is to say, a life of toil where inevitably the sorrows outweigh the joys. Placed between the beast and the gods, man raises and sacrifices the former in honor of the deities. A central practice, sacrifice, is a celebration that brings together all the meaning of the word dividing, separation from the god, separation from the animals, though not without a certain closeness. You don't sacrifice a wild animal. To sacrifice is to acknowledge that you are mortal, in need of nourishment. Though unequal, the dividing of the animal is also a form of sharing with the gods, who rejoice in sacrifices in their honor. Finally, the sharing of the ghosts of the ox or the sheep is the occasion for a banquet, a sharing with commensals, relatives, or fellow citizens. A few words about what I call a Trojan horse, that is an immortal soul. After his condemnation, Socrates, speaking for the last time, maintains that there is no need to dread death. Either, he says, it's a deep sleep where all consciousness disappears. And what could be better than such a night? Or it's a journey of the soul to Hades, where all the dead are met, whom Socrates will then hasten to question. In any case, those over there are happier than those here, if only because they can no longer experience death. You don't die twice. This pleasant Hades is closer to the islands of the blessed than to the place populated by forgetful shadows visited by Odysseus. But the point to remember is that Socrates envisages a journey of the soul, psyche, and of a soul which, having left the body, retain all its faculties. Whether death is sleep or travel, death, Socrates concludes, must be seen as a good. With this alternative, Plato, in fact, presents two visions of death for the Greeks. The most common, according to which there is nothing after or beyond death, the other, in which the immortality, at least of the soul, emerges. This alternative opens up the immense and long debated problem of the soul. Let's limit ourselves to this one remark. Inevitably, the recognition of an immortal soul calls into question all the division hitherto established by the first anthropology, starting with the now insurmountable frontier between mortality and immortality. Plato has remained the major architect of this reversal. So I jump to the dissolution. Without, for the sole purpose of this presentation, let's move on to the 1970s. What was the intellectual conjuncture like And in what terms did the question of dividing arise? Juxtaposing these two moments, however far apart they may be, have the advantage of highlighting the contrast between them, casting a cross-light on both. During these years, anthropos was called into question from a variety of quarters, with varying degrees of radicalism, from philosophy, anthropology, neuroscience, sciences, and paleontology, but also from feminist movement, more recently from ecofeminism, animalist movements, transhumanist, and finally from the aptly misnamed Anthropocene. Concomitant, yet partially independent, these multiple critics share a common recusal of something specific to human beings. In 1966, in the finale of Les mots et les choses, Foucault, as you know, diagnosed that man, I quote, is perishing as the being of language shines more brightly on the horizon. Asked 3 years later about this death of man, which, says the journalist with whom he spoke, has aroused great emotion and innumerable controversies among our good humanists, he replies, quote, "There is no need to be particularly moved by the end of man. It's only the particular case, or if you like, one of the visible forms of a much more general demise. By this, I do not mean the death of God, but the death of the subject, of the capital, subject with capital, of the subject at the origin and foundation of knowledge with capital, freedom, language, and history." And about the so-called human sciences, I believe, quote, that the human sciences do not lead at all to the discovery of something that would be the human, the truth of man, his nature, his birth, his destiny. What the various human sciences are really concerned with is something quite different from man. They are systems, structures, combinations, form, and so on. Consequently, if we wish to deal seriously with the human sciences, we must first and foremost destroy the obnoxious chimeras constituted by the idea that we must search for man. Man, human being, is not the game of the human sciences, and the homo humanus of the humanist tradition is nothing but a chimera. In fact, he adds, the idea of man worked in the 19th century in much the same way as the idea of God had worked in previous centuries. And yet, says Foucault, we were still terrified by the idea of a humanity that could continue to function without God. Hence, the conviction that the idea of God had to be maintained if humanity was to continue to function. And in those years, Foucault used pretty much the notion of function. Now, you say to me, he addresses the journalist, perhaps it's necessary for the idea of humanity to exist, even if it's only a myth for humanity to function. My answer is maybe, but maybe not. Neither more nor less than the idea of God. Though the general idea is clear, man, humanity, humanism are myths, and we are discovering that we can function without them. As far as anthropology is concerned, one of the great questions of the discipline has been the division between nature and culture. Having in fact developed around this very division, it will first question it, then challenge it. Philippe Descolas' work, the French anthropologist, is topical in this respect. Indeed, his questionnaire largely stems from the opposition between nature and culture. But the further he progressed, the more he was led to go beyond this dualism, to advocate what he called a fully monistic anthropology beyond nature and culture. Getting rid of all dualism is in fact a major feature of our current situation. Beyond nature and culture, the book, in which he set out his path and proposed nothing less than a new departure for anthropology, was born, he says, out of a feeling of dissatisfaction with the way in which the relationship between nature and society was handled. A first effort at clarification consisted in demonstrating that the opposition between nature and culture does not possess the universality that is attributed to it, because it's devoid of meaning for anyone other than moderns. And he's using modern in the sense of Bruno Latour. One freed of this ethnocentric presupposition, the anthropologist is in a position to hear what they are, for what they are, other cosmologies, which confer on animals and plants most of the attributes of humanity. Indeed, many so-called primitive societies, he writes, invites us to go beyond the division we have established between humans and non-humans, who have never, so I quote, who have never thought that the boundaries of humanity stopped at the gates of the human species, who do not hesitate to invite the most modest of plants, the most insignificant of animals, into the concert of their social life. Anthropology, therefore, faces a formidable challenge, to quote, either to disappear with an exhausted form of humanism, or to metamorphose by rethinking its field and its tool in such a way as to include in its subject much more than just anthropos, the entire collectivity of existing beings linked to it and now relegated to the function of entourage. Naturalism, which is specific of the West, according to Descolas, has increasingly separated humans and non-humans. Faced with this treatment of what exists, animism occupies an antithetical position. Indeed, it can be defined as, quote, the imputation by humans to non-humans of an interiority identical to their own. This disposition humanizes plants, and especially animals, since the soul they are under, which enable them not only to behave according to the social norms and ethical precepts of human, but also to establish communicative relationship with the latter and with each other. The similarity of their inner selves thus authorize an extension of the state of culture to non-humans. However, this humanization is not complete, for in an animistic system, those kind of disguised humans that are plants and animals are distinguished from humans precisely by their clothing of feathers, hair, scales, or bark, in other words, by their physicality. From this very rapid comparison, of naturalistic and animistic ontologies, we can see that naturalistic ontology, in Descolas' sense, gives man a special status, while animistic ontology does not. Does this mean that the human has disappeared? No. On the contrary, it extends it, things, plants, and animals share the same interiority as human, the same soul. In any case, animism can be said to be anthropogenic and, of course, not anthropocentric, insofar as it brings about from humans all that is necessary for non-humans to be treated as humans. When all is said and done, naturalism appears for what it is, one of the four ontologies, one of the ways of putting existing things in order, but whose claim to be the standard for the other three are unfounded. The dualism that runs through its long history up to the nature-culture divide on which ethnology has settled has made modern science possible, which is not which is something, but it has also inscribed a boundary between humans and non-humans, leading to, quote, regime of apartheid. Now, very quickly also, a few words about putting an end to human exceptionalism. With the structural man, we gave, at the moment of the structuralism, with structural man, we gave everything to culture and nothing to nature. With, I take this example, Jean-Pierre Changeux's neuronal man in 1983, the opposite is true. He is fully and uniquely natural, so much so that the animal-human body, soul, brain, spirit divisions are no longer relevant. I quote, in terms of both the macroscopic anatomy of the cortex and its microscopic architecture, there is no sudden qualitative reorganization from animal to human brain. On the contrary, there is a quantitative and continuous evolution of the total number of neurons, and therefore of the complexity of the neural networks that make up the cerebral machine. End of quote. Philosopher Francis Wolff draws a general remark from Changeux's observation. Under this condition, he writes, there is no longer an other of man. Structural man had broken with God, the great other. There was no upward boundary. Neuronal man breaks with the, so to speak, little other, if you like, the animal. There are no more downward boundaries. Under the empire of the biological, man can no longer be defined in opposition to all other living beings. Neuronal man is one because he is a living being, but because he is a living being, he is no longer properly human. This is the effect of the substitution of the methodological monism of the natural sciences for the methodological dualism of structural man. End of quote. From the perspective of evolutionary biology, man not only has a biological part, human being is a biological being. This is his identity. As a result, hominization must be seen as the result of historical sequences in the evolution of living things, with no, of course, finalism at work. Paleontology has shown that there is no one humanity, but many humanities. The vision of Homo sapiens as the ultimate fruit of the hominization process is no longer tenable. Homo sapiens may be the most recent human species, but it has coexisted with other human species for thousands of years. Going back to our ancestors makes it problematic to draw a line between man and non-man. From this biologization of the human questions, it follows that not that social and cultural facts are epiphenomena grafted onto a biological nature, but that they are intrinsic aspects of human biological identity. Thus, historical and therefore social and cultural time is a specific form of humanity's biological time. Culture does not transcend the biology of man, but is one of its major features. Beyond false opposition, and in particular, the most flawed of them all, that between nature and culture. By actively promoting an augmented man, transhumanists are working to lower or even eliminate the boundary not between animals and man, but between human being and machine. Contrary to the teaching of evolutionary biology, they remain dualists. There is the brain and there is the body. In an increasingly near future, as this philosopher Jean-Michel Besnier sums up, technoscientific progress will enable us to escape the physical constraints characteristic of the human condition. How will we live without being born, since we will be able to result from a technical production without suffering or falling ill, since nanomedicine will prevent us from doing so. And finally, without dying, since we'll be able, for example, to download the content of our consciousness onto some inalterable material that can be implemented on demand in some substitute body. Our transformation into cyborgs will then be nearing completion. The best-known prophet of the coming disruption, Ray Kurzweil, predicts the arrival of the singularity in 2045, when, quote, we will be able to multiply our actual intelligence by a billion by merging it with the artificial intelligence we have created. Thanks to the ever-accelerating development of artificial intelligence, combined with advance in nanotechnology, biotechnology, and cognitive sciences, the union of the technical and the biological will produce an hybrid being. Will we still need to speak of an augmented man, or will it be a man-machine in the sense of a sort of a humanized machine? Nick Bostrom, director of the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University, while aware of the existential risk that artificial intelligence can pose, is convinced of the considerable benefits it can bring. Not surprisingly, the elimination of poverty, disease, aging, and death, the downloading of our minds into computer, and so on. Sam Altman, Silicon Valley's new phoenix, says it's all on his world tour promoting ChatGPT. Things are moving so fast that Elon Musk and his company Neuralink have obtained permission to test their brain implants on humans, enabling them to control computers by thought. This technological advance are cause for concern. In a book published in 2023, an American philosopher and jurist, Nita Farahani, urged legislators to concern themselves with the defense of what she calls cognitive freedom, a dimension of personal liberty now threatened by possible malicious intrusion into the brain. And we know that the ingenuity of hackers is always one step ahead. With the prospect of augmented man, the one receiving the most media attention, could come at last the transgression and abolition of the oldest division, men are mortal, from which we start. But where the Greeks set up a three-term scheme, immortals, beast, men, transhumanists think they can get away with a single term, namely a technological reformulation of the mantra, man is a god for man. In the form, there is no other god than augmented man. And it's within our reach. Better still, it's already here. Other living beings, whether animal or plants, don't hold their attention. Anthropocentric, if not exclusive, transhumanist, transhumanist will save themselves, provided they can get enough electrical power for long enough. If human beings are no longer mortal, do they have access to immortality? No. Having entered the afterlife of the singularity in a new space-time, their lot would be rather that of a amortality, more or less indexed to the possibilities of successive uploading from one machine to another. With their amortality would come not anti-humanism or inhumanism, but something like digital humanism. A few words about feminism. Here again, I will be following just one thread, that of nature and culture. Since women association with nature is a very old story, and will be doing so only on the basis of historian of science and feminist Caroline Merchant's book, The Death of Nature, Women, Ecology, and the Scientific Revolution, in which she studied a tipping point in this long history. Her book was widely acclaimed for three reasons, and that's in the preface of the last edition. I quote, "It was one of the first critics of the problems of modernism, and in particular of mechanistic science and the worldview associated with it, which gave rise to the postmodern deconstruction of enlightenment, optimism, and progress. Secondly, as ecofeminism came to the fore during the 1980s and 1990s, the book was seen as an avant-garde statement of the relationship between women and nature. Thirdly, it paved the way for a reassessment of the ethical relationship between humans and nature, moving away from ideas of domination and towards a dynamic new partnership between people and their environment. The period under consideration was between the 16th and 17th century, when the Renaissance organic vision of the cosmos, in which all elements were related to one another, were replaced by a mechanistic representation in which nature is reconceptualized as dead and passive, to be dominated and controlled by humans. Remaining bound to nature, women thus find themselves doubly inferior. They are on the side of this passive nature to be dominated, but they are also on the side of that wild part of nature that escapes control. It's the witch, a loosed, a diabolical Sabbath that must be hunted down and burned at the stake. And so it was. In other words, the accentuation of the distinction between nature and culture was to the detriment of women. Yet, for the ecofeminists of the 1980s and 90s, the domination of nature and that of women are in fact two intersecting dominations that refer to each other. Caroline Merchant's book provides a major reference point for understanding how the two are intertwined when we move from an organicist vision of the universe to mechanisms, and suggest ways out. Since the deepening of the dichotomy between nature and culture has been a factor of the construction of modern Europe, and is also in the subordination of or naturalization of women, its recusal must enable women to break free from this assignment. The rejection of this long-standing dualism, while in line with that of the life sciences, paleontology, and anthropology, does not mean that ecofeminists wish to abandon all reference to nature. Indeed, at the end of her book, Merchant suggests that a reassessment of the constraints and values historically associated with the organic worldview may be essential for a viable future. And which ones? Those of cyclical processes, the interconnectedness of all things, and the assumption that nature is active and alive. What's more, organicism, which precede mechanicism in Europe, was widespread in societies on other continents and has remained so to this day. This is why ecofeminists, attentive to women's struggles around the world, have put forward proposal for reclaiming the positive relationship between women and nature without returning to some kind of eternal femininity. Donna Haraway polymorphous work is another example of this refusal to accept the division between nature and culture, and more broadly, the dualism that accompanied the circumscription of humans' own nature. Distrustful of theories, which are always simplistic, she seeks to create and tell new stories that privilege improbable and significant encounters between all these critters, as she called them, human and non-human. Gone are the days of the very history of man and history. What we need today, she said, are geo-histories, with a test for etymologies to draw out the effects of meaning. She brings human closer to, to humus, the earth, something the Romans were not unaware of. But without stopping there, she draws all the consequences. If this is so, I quote, why not prefer compost, more evocative than humus, to posthuman and posthumanism, or humusities to humanities? Humans are humus, as humus may well have a future, if only we can chop up humans as homo, the winning project of a self-made man-human manager of a planet-demolishing enterprise. End of quote. Under these conditions, to call the Anthropocene an era in which man, anthropos, is stripped of all exceptionality seems highly inappropriate, since neither the human species nor man with capital M and tool with capital T make history. Terra's inhabitants invent ways of living and dying that are interwoven, intertwined, and tentacular, but they don't make history. Similarly, against the transhumanist and posthumanist claim to an autopoiesis of the human being, she argues for sympoiesis. It's not true that mortal worlds, by whatever name they are called, happen on their own. There are always partners involved. In the beginning, she would say, was not dividing, but interaction. A significantly titled book, Staying with the Trouble, or better still, Inhabiting the Trouble, is dedicated to the makers of mismatched kingships. In all cases, the obsolete dividing line between nature and culture is erased, while hybridity is valorized, acknowledging that the times in which we live are troubled and troubling, and proposing not to emerge from trouble, but to inhabit it, also means opting for a relationship with time that privileges the present. Inhabiting disorder means inhabiting the present, and only the present, by making it habitable, precisely so that a livable future for all living beings is possible. Rejecting futurism, positive or negative, the proposal is to thicken the present, to enrich it with all the connections, all the active reciprocities that make it a living density. So, Donna Haraway, while not doubting the devastating effect of human activity on the Earth system, intends to use the term Anthropocene sparingly. In fact, to do so would be to do too much honor to this anthropos, which she would like to chop up. Indeed, it's inappropriate for him to give his name to this new epoch, which she believed should more appropriately be called the Capitalocene, because, quote, it's not Anthropos who is in charge of his damned hydraulic fracturing. Rather, we need to see, and above all, experience the epoch as the twilight of this Anthropos, which leaves behind him a world in ruins, and as the possible opening of a common world bringing together humans and non-humans, transcending masculine and feminine, and cultivating interrelations and hybridization. According to the new division proposed by the late Bruno Latour, humans are those still living in the Holocene era and clinging to what he called the old climate regime, while Earthlings, human and non-humans combined, are of the Anthropocene and have taken note of the new climate regime. Inevitable then is a conflict or the war between humans living in the Holocene epoch and Earthling of the Anthropocene. From this last brief sequence in which feminism, ecofeminism, and climate crisis meet, it's clear that if there is an Anthropocene, it means in fact the end of the human, or man with capital letter, the disintegration of the ci-devant humans, as Latour, fond of analogy with the French Revolution, put it. For the anthropologist, the Brazilian anthropologist, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, such a world without man would in fact come to meet the all-in-person world made entirely of subjects of Amerindian cosmogonies, for which there is not on the one hand humanity and on the other the world, on the one hand culture and on the other nature, but a real consubstantiality of the two. Having followed very different paths, the world after man and the world of animism, not before man, but where, on the contrary, everything was originally human, would thus come to correspond. The latter could, if not propose itself as a model, at least be seriously meditated upon by the former. The anthropos of the Anthropocene, concluded Bruno Latour, not hesitating to mobilize the Bible this time, is Babel after the fall of the giant tower. At last, he said, human beings can no longer be unified. At last, he is no longer off the ground. At last, he is no longer outside earthly history. Thus, we have gone too fast from the circumscription of Anthropos in the Greek universe through a series of divisions to its dissolution through the questioning of these very divisions and the rejection of all the dualism that had hitherto served to conceive of the order of the world and man's proper nature. Thank you very much.
But I wanted to take chair privilege and ask one little question of this, which is, I wanted to understand a little bit better the lineage that you draw from Foucault onward. Is this suggestion that these are all, is there a kind of direct line that you're following there from Foucault through Descola through to Changeux and so on? Or is there a sense of mutual criticisms that is being played out in your analysis? And what is the character of this analysis? The reason why I ask is that, in a way, there is a sort of critical tradition in these. So Foucault, Descola, then Haraway, but then there's also a very clear sense of a kind of frontier of either real science or like fantasy science with a ton of money behind it. So I would say that I would have seen a structural difference. The movement from neuroscience in the early 80s when it's exploding in cash through ChatGPT, which is also, what did they say yesterday, that it's 180 billion that OpenAI is now worth within a year and a half of this operation. So I'm very curious as to how, if one is sort of proving the ugly side of the other argument, or if you see it as a kind of départagement that's a kind of consequence of this sort of pressure.
There is no direct line to or even to change it. And I'm unable to. The fact was that more or less around 1970, you had coming from quarters this kind of questioning, not necessarily being aware of what they were doing, on their own logic, but convergence. And there you have some kind of a way the smallest common denominator between them. Is of something is there something.
Good. And for those who are online on Zoom, feel free to put a question in the Q&A.
Yeah, nice. So I could do it. Okay, so thank you for this very thought-provoking talk. I mean, think a lot. I have a very easy question. I mean, as you mentioned yourself, I mean, all these kind of new ways of putting together nature and culture and so on and so forth, and machine and so on. I mean, the kind of original aid are the 1970s. So historians have shown that the 1970s are the decade as a kind of turning point in a lot of issues. In particular, I mean, we talk too often about neoliberal turn or these kind of things. So how could you describe the historical context in which these kind of ideas are emerging. Do you have any idea about the way you could reconstruct this context in order to, try to reconcile, I mean, all the other turn of the 1970s?
That's not an easy question.
I know, but it's a question which is, yeah.
And, because in a way, I feel more with that earlier in the book. But as far if we take point of departure, now is it not probably equal of this statement. We have to, in order to understand, we have to go back to what happened. It's very clear, and very clear that the questioning of human being, of man, earlier, Nietzsche and Foucault is, but also Heidegger. But with you, if I'm extremely schematic, would say that structuralism was a way to work, while it was not possible to face what that. And so, and after that, having really and it is most development of that, perhaps without being really aware of a new conjuncture. As far as if we go to changer, that's different. The interesting thing is that it starts by not by well, that's or it starts by saying up now the human sciences have had a major role, and they gave everything to culture and nothing to nature. And I'm going to explain that it does not work like that. So his positioning is, at least in this book, which is for the audience than the but he's positioning himself as things which necessary. Start by, well, we have to rethink and to, and doing that, I think that's all we have to do to get all nature, nothing to.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk, which reminded me in many ways. Can you hear me? No. Yes, of course. Sure. Thank you very much for this talk, which reminded me. Can you hear me now? Is it? In many ways of your work on presentism and time regimes, also regarding the chronology, and I would be interested to know how they're connected. But that is not my question. I just wanted to drop that line. My question refers to the very interesting and also highly entertaining jump that you made from Hesiod into the 1970s. Because I would want to ask if you don't need an intermediary step, namely modern humanism, early modern humanism, which refigures humanism, I think, with divisions, to speak in your terminology, that are very different from the antique ones. So that I would even say the anti-humanism of the 20th century is in many ways also the attempt to get back to the ancients, to break with early modern or modern humanism. You think of Nietzsche, think of Heidegger, and many others. It's not a coincidence that they were all in love with the ancients and their anti-humanism. And that's also true, I think, for late 20th century. Versions of anti-humanism, kinds of anti-humanism were trying to break with a modern humanism, and some of them did that with the idea to, get back to antiquity. And I think, one of the defining divisions of modern humanism, correct me if I'm wrong, which is really not part of the antique humanism, is the division between human and cosmos. Right? The modern human is existentially, it has lost the connection to the cosmos, whereas the ancient human is, like a cosmopolitan, a citizen of the cosmos. That's this late and idea of a harmony between the humans and the cosmos, even though they're mortals. So that seems to me a very different kind of division, and that, of course, is also strongly connected to the division between nature and culture that you refer to. But that is exactly not an antique one. So the, let's say, postmodern anti-humanism, 20th century anti-humanism, contemporary anti-humanism has beef with early modern, the modern human, but not with the antique.
Nathan, to also ask you questions.
Thank you. So that follows the last question, which is if you can unpack for us a little bit the relationship between regimes of historicity, Chronos, and this book. And just to pinpoint what I find in need of unpacking, some of the critique of the last two books, I'm thinking about the form that History and Theory edited, was about the Christian regime of historicity as the core of that chronology, right? Or the historiosophy behind that chronology. And I wonder if this chronology now doesn't, in a way, double down, immanentize that chronology or that critique of presentness from that perspective. And just to last thing about it is if the regime of historicity, you seem to critique that from the outside, in here you seem to actually follow that division, right? I don't think so.
But you are right. But they said I was obliged to jump. So why is it we spend the day? I need to take into consideration what you said. Not an answer. It's clear that big change gave me the they call Homo Christianus, which last well, you had to rethink of that Roman anthropology. I just meditated on that in a word. As soon as you have a God eternal, everything changes. The question is, have we an access to this eternity? And Christian, yes. And that's so. Here, that's from then on. What you mean by humanism changed drastically. And what mostly against Christianus, that and this formulation of 19th century of man and protagonist of that Feuerbach. From Feuerbach you have Marx. After that, against. So, well, I agree with what you say. And not simply juxtapose and of humanism, anti-humanism. There is some correlation, of course. But move from Homo Christianus, which is who is in a way there forever, or not forever, until the end. And the end is something you have prepared. You have to be prepared. In the modern time, modern regime, modern time. Realization of put in the future. It's very clear. Or even earlier about it. For example, for Condorcet. Progress. Feuerbach also. Human is hating religion of man. Marx. And even Nietzsche, who is so anti-modern, so much anti-modern, has an opening to the for human.
For Superman.
That is not yet there, or and even the also face of God, announcement of God has not yet used. So you have also this dimension. And that's something which disappears.
Well, yeah, a characteristic sweeping account, and I'm going to try and tie together something from the beginning and the end, but you'll correct me if I get lost in the weeds. So one of the things at play here is in this story of division is also that which is indivisible, you could say, and we see this even at the very setup with the syllogism you provide about Socrates, the man, the mortal man, is, well, mortals are subject to history, they have a lifespan that's absolutely divisible. Syllogism, at least in theory, is adheres to the rule of logic. This is a permanent truth. It's always the case, even if you have some faulty syllogism, the syllogism that works is always going to work. It's in that way indivisible. I mean, you could take it apart, but it's truth. If it's truth, is there for forever, for always. It is an eternal truth. And so you get not only this kind of divisible and indivisible, but also this finite infinite or eternal versus mortal. Well, but let's get to the sempiternal, because that's different, because I would say the syllogism shouldn't be sempiternal, it should be eternal, it should always be there. It's not going to disappear. But then in the story that goes on, the division that seems to happen is a losing of that infinite or that eternal in favor of this sempiternal, so an eternity that's on a timeline. And along the way, then we lose, especially after the 70s, or we seem to lose, what I would say is the indivisible. The indivisible seems to have gone away, as I guess on your account have the gods, maybe the infinite, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess both structuralism and Descartes could marshal an argument for something that's infinite along this way. But at the very end, when you get to the singularity, the story you give of the singularity is of the cyborg, right? So that's the sempiternal. But there's another version of the singularity that's out there by these same thinkers, which is that intelligence will have no need of us. This is to say that we'll become, in essence, mortals once again in relation to whatever these new gods, future gods, swimming on a future ocean, to quote Foucault, coming in. And that is a kind of reinstatement, at least on your account, of this infinite and of this relationship. And so I wonder, first of all, about these divisions between divisibility and indivisibility, whether they do play out in the way I'm characterizing or not. Second of all, about this sort of alternative end, which does sort of, that's chiastic. We start off with the gods, it's immortal and infinite, and the humans, or I guess sempiternal eventually, they become eternal again once they become the Christian ones. And then we end again with reinstating a God, which is sempiternal in the form of the one that needs power and a servant and all these things, and yet somehow seems endless.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. My question relates a little bit to the last one. I would like to ask you for your opinion about the possibility to differentiate the discourse a little bit. So I think maybe we have a discourse, a theoretical discourse from the 1970s on, so Foucault, Haraway, until new materialism, and that is very much about decentering the human being. Decentering. So put it in a net of relations. So it's decentering is anthropos. And then I would say we have a scientific technological discourse on technological enhancement, which is enhancing the human, but it's not decentering, but it's making the human better. So, and making it even the crown of everything. And then we have this post-biological discourse, which is overcoming humanity, humans, anthropos, by technology. I think, in my opinion, it could be important to make this differentiation between three different kinds of overcoming dichotomies. I don't know if it's...
Well, enhancement is enhancement, betterment, not. So, how do you evaluate, I would, what kind of judgment on this. Hence, being question being is think that kind of accomplishment. Kind of solutions. But I'm not sure to have clearly understood.
I just try with one sentence. I try to categorize this discourse into 3 different threads. So it's not judging it by my own, but try to say there are differences between this huge discourse of overcoming dichotomies. So it's a theoretical, philosophical, cultural studies discourse, technological, scientific discourse, and this one I would split into 2 different strands again. I can discuss it later with you.
Now we are we coming back to some kind of pretending to have been to be rid of realism? Are we not finally reintroduce to think about it?
So in the back and then.
Thank you for your talk. That's just a very quick comment. In considering this question about the line from Foucault to ChatGPT, I was just wondering if there isn't a more obvious line from Roland Barthes, Death of the Author, to ChatGPT. But anyway, that was just a stray thought I had. My question actually relates a little bit to this intervening period of humanism that, for understandable reasons, wasn't there in your talk. But I was thinking in terms of some of the Enlightenment views of humans and the sorts of divisions created there. You know, not the humans, gods, humans, animals, humans, machines, etc., but within humans themselves. And so when you pick up from Foucault and the others that you discuss, there's an assumed singularity in the notion of the human. And I'm wondering whether, and I know that you've written elsewhere about this construction of humans and others, but what happened to those Enlightenment views of distinguishing between humans? Often as sort of superior humans and lesser humans. Have we now completely gone beyond that? Is that period over? Now that we're contemplating humans in relation to machines, humans in relation to nature?
Sorry, but I'm It's okay. I thought it was. I didn't know. I think that. Holds here very well. Um, with the Enlightenment, you have an extension of one being, extension in space, and also in time. And comes question of the limits. When the human being starts, for example, by someone like and also geographical. There is some sort human starts to be active. But as soon as you have this attention, comes the question of the who. And start to have the question. Some are others. After one day. The question, the way the question disappears. It's no longer I don't know what to that answer. But I think it would have said what is the point? And after what I was this moment of intense dehumanization practice.
I wonder if your argument, your narrative doesn't really end up in a more dystopian and darker place than you indicate. I mean, a Schmittian place where the remaining sovereign decides, because of the let me give you an example. Because of the overpopulation that would inevitably occur as a result of the augmented beings, someone is going to have to decide which beings get augmented and which don't. And that's the Schmittian sovereign. You restore the kind of Zeus-like Schmittian figure at the end.
I am the end. Not exactly the end. Okay. As I was struck by this vengeance of questioning around 1970. And exactly at the same time, same years, you have development, very quick development of humanitarian. And by the same people. That is, on one side, you say there is nothing as belongs properly to, well, on the other side, you have all these young doctors saying, we have to go where, and we have to, in the name of the dignity of man, without asking the pedagogical question. Name of dignity, we have to be there, and we have to be on the side of the victims, whoever they are. And so I simply notice a running of this.
I think we should let you off the hook.